Our series, Show and Tell, will take you inside some of the great libraries, both public and private, to explore books and treasures from Jewish history. We began as the luminary,
Yes.
radiance. What room are we in now?
So this is called prism.
Prism.
Yes. And it's a multiplicity of Maimonides, a multiplicity of images. When you walk in, you can see there's just this openness and also a refraction. There's sort of refracted light. This happens in the modern period. Referred to previously that, Maimonides was one person.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he was a physician and philosopher and a legalist, but these are not divisions within him. There's to some extent, that begins in what we showed in the following centuries, and certainly by the modern period and where we live today and how we live today.
Now it becomes a real prism.
There's a great division and compartmentalization that exists. So this is part of that story, including where we are today and who we are today. The cases here, the objects here, run from the 18th century, picking up where we were, but straight until today, to the modern day. Two of the most significant pieces, I think, here are this very unassuming page right here in the middle. This is the writing.
Looks like a luach, like a calendar.
That's exactly what it is.
You see March, April. I mean, you can even make out the dates. Who wrote this? Why is it significant?
This was written by Isaac Newton.
The Isaac Newton.
The Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton used Maimonides. He was concerned with calendar reform.
Mm-hmm.
So the modern Western calendar that we have, the Gregorian calendar, was adopted in England in the 1750s. This was written in London around 1699. He was working on calendar reform at the time, and he turned to Maimonides, the laws of the new moon, where Maimonides has this concept of how you can predict the new moon, and Newton was working with that.
Fascinating. And is it unusual that Isaac Newton would turn to the Rambam? I mean, he was a chair in Cambridge. I mean, he was a serious person.
So,
why turn to the Rambam to get calendar advice?
It's a good question. Maimonides was highly regarded, not just in the Jewish world, but in fact was studied, including in England, in the 17th and the 18th centuries. It's not unheard of that Newton would have turned to Maimonides.
And Newton in particular had a real fascination with Jewish texts.
Yes, and what's interesting, so this you can say, okay, we understand Newton as a scientist, as a mathematician. But there's another element that lots of people are not aware of, although scholars have worked on this significantly in recent decades, which was that he had an entire religious and spiritual and eschatological side to him.
Sure.
And so there's another place
wasn't a small side.
Correct, and he didn't just use Maimonides with respect to science or to mathematics, but in fact turned to Maimonides when he was to Maimonides' description of the biblical temple.
Yes.
And as far as Newton was concerned, Solomon's temple, the dimensions of it represented the cosmos, and therefore when he wrote a treatise on the temple, he turned to Maimonides, which lots of people would, in order to try and understand what did the temple look like.
Absolutely fascinating. It's my Parshas Truma year.
Oh,
Jewish history in the Parsha. I did it. It's Parshas Truma.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Another great piece. This is actually from the American Jewish Historical Society, which is also here at the Center for Jewish History, one of the partner institutions with the YU Museum here. It is a prayer composed in New York following the Revolution, the American Revolution, by a cantor about whom we know very little, almost nothing.
In America.
In America, in New York, a cantor of Sheret Israel, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And here, it's a reference, there are references to the 13 states, and we've got Governor Clinton and General Washington mentioned. And the reason it's significant here is because this cantor also referred to Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. In other words, the 13 and the 13.
And the 13 colonies, so to speak, the 13 states, have this parallel to the 13 principles, have this mystical connection almost.
And the characteristics, God's midot, and that as well.
So. That is fascinating. And you can literally see it. I see right over here, George Washington, a very curious spelling of the name George.
Yeah, that's great.
But I'll let them off with that. Just don't use that for your ksubas. That's absolutely fascinating. Kashem shenasata shalos esro medinos America elu lecheres olam kain totzienu shenis me'atos lecheres. Just like you gave us these 13 shalosh esrei, like you're using the real language of the 13 colonies of America that you gave them for freedom to the world, so too you should take us a second time, me'atos lecheres, the Jewish people, so to speak.
And as Americans.
This is a really fascinating text. He writes over here, Kashem shenasata koach l'Shimshon ben Manoach, just like you gave strength for Shimshon, like the story in Nevi'im, so too they're also asking you should also give Techazek Magin Yeshua la'adonenu Rosh V'sar Hatzava, George Washington. George Washington should also be strengthened and have that strength like Shimshon, who fought. What a fascinating prayer.
The pieces here all relate to what's happening in the modern period. So you've got an appreciation of medieval Sfarad, an association of Maimonides and Isaac Abarbanel. You have in Yemen a response to using Maimonides as a response to the rise of Kabbalah. This manuscript was copied in the 19th century it was a copy from a manuscript that's currently in the Bodleian Library. It was part of the academic study that's developing. You have famous classics, so maybe you want to say something else specifically about this? Yes.
This is the first edition of Reb Chaim Halevi, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik on the Rambam. That's become a classic for really the brisker analysis of the Rambam. It was published, I believe, after his lifetime by his children. There's a brisker tradition long held that they like to publish after the author already passes. Why this is significant to me is because I also inherited one of these from my grandfather. It was published in 1936. My grandfather was born in 1915, and he got a copy when he went to learn in Yeshiva. He learned in Torah V'das, and he was the first graduating class of Yeshiva's Chafetz Chaim with under Rav David Leibowitz, who was a great nephew of the Chafetz Chaim. But the one thing that I got from my grandfather's library, I don't have it under a glass case, and it's not quite in as good condition, but I also have this first edition, and it's...
Your grandfather learned from it.
Yeah. And I learned from it. Okay, I like this one.
This one, right. It's right. So we mentioned Chabad before, so Lubavitcher Rebbe instituted beginning in 1984 this regular study of the Mishnah Torah, this daily study, and then there's a cycle of it. And this is a New York Times article from 1986 referring to the celebration when they finished it. The Siyum.
On the 750th anniversary of the passing of the Rambam, his yahrzeit, I believe the New York Times went to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the grandson of Reb Chaim Halevi that we see over here, to ask him for a quote. Maimonides is passed. Do you have a quote for the newspaper? Rabbi Soloveitchik responded, "This is the first I'm hearing that the Rambam is dead."
Oh yes, famously.